r/r AskReddit. Rangers, forest workers, hunters, and other woods people of Reddit, what is your scary experience in the woods that you still can't explain? A few years back, when I was around the age of 14 and my brother was 9, my dad, my little brother, and I all went out deer hunting in the afternoon right before sundown. While we were walking through the woods, before we even got started, my little brother tugged on my arm and asked me if I saw that. I said that it was probably his imagination and he let go of my arm. A few minutes later, I couldn't hear him walking behind us anymore, and turned around to find him gone. I quickly told my dad and we looked for him for, at the least, half an hour. When he walked over out of nowhere towards the both of us, he was covered in mud like he'd fallen somewhere. I worriedly asked where he'd gone and he just stared at me, telling me that he couldn't remember and thought that he had never left. He acted normally afterwards just as nothing had happened. I don't know if this is really scary to anyone else, but it shook my entire family, including myself, quite a bit. Edit, to answer a few of your questions. Several of you have been asking whether or not he could tell or show me where he had been, and the answer is no. As I said, although I hadn't specified, so that might have been on me, he told me that he couldn't remember a thing. Not what happened, not why he was covered in mud, not why he had walked away in the first place, nor that he had walked away at all. The only thing that he said he could recall was walking a few steps away from us, after seeing a doe from behind him, and that's it. He told me that he genuinely hadn't remembered walking away from us and acted like no time had passed. Also, one of you had asked how muddy it was. I distinctly remember that we had several flood warnings and heavy rains before then, but it wasn't like knee-high deep mud. It had been in the middle of fall and I can remember myself being irritated at the mud and leaves sticking to my boots. He wasn't drenched in mud, after we found him, but his knees and the palms of his hands were coated in it, along with having a few splotches here and there on his clothes. I had one other question on whether or not I asked him what he saw in the first place. He had initially told me after the entire event that he had saw a glimpse of a tall person standing next to a tree, which I, to be completely honest, doubt. As a kid, I also had one hell of an imagination, and was very paranoid, which I believe was passed down from my mother to the two of us. Lastly, someone had asked how I had found him. I'm not sure if that's the right way to word it. Anyways, all three of us had been walking north, and later on, when I did find him, he had trotted out of the woods, avoiding trees, from the west. Before he had gotten to me, he hadn't really spoke, until I ran up to him and hugged him, asking if he was okay. I hope this answers most of the questions you had. Kinda creepy thing happened to me when I was a student forester this summer. So, the forest I was working in was about 20 km from the nearest town, which contained around 1,200 people, and we usually set out for whatever task we have to do in the forest at around 7 a.m. So we are at the forest at around 7:30 a.m. and we are about 12 km up the road when we turn a corner very slowly and see what I initially thought to be a weird looking bush or statue, but it was in fact a person, sitting on a carved out stump on the side of the road, just sitting there. What really threw me off was the fact that this person had a parka on and a balaclava underneath it in the middle of summer. We drove by this person real slow and he lifted a hand to wave slowly as we drove past, and it was just super creepy. Never saw them again after that, but it did make going out on excursions a little more uneasy sometimes when alone. I've shared this story before. We have a camp that we visit during the hunting months and about every other weekend in between that. To get to our camp, you have to turn off of a major road onto a gravel road, drive about a mile, then turn onto another gravel road for about a half mile. It's set between a few other camps, plus some residents that live out there. It's quiet, for the most part. There are some coyotes and bobcats. Bobcats are the worst due to their terrible scream. It sounds like a woman crying for help. There has also been a black panther and wild dogs. 2013 we were at the camp for Thanksgiving. We hunted, fished, cooked, drank, all that good camp stuff. On night, we're sitting around a fire, swapping funny stories and just listening to the silence of the woods. As we're talking, we all hear, "Help me." At first, we thought it was a bobcat. We listened some more and heard it again. It was a man's voice yelling "Help me," repeatedly. Now, our first instinct was to grab our guns. Second was to go towards the voice, but you never know what you will encounter in the woods. It was dark and cold. The hunters knew the area very well. We called the police, and explained everything to the responding officers. The weird part was that we never once heard it while the officers were with us. Not once. The officers left and we heard the man again, repeating "Help me." About half an hour later, the officers came back and we didn't hear any call for help. Again, silence. We all decided it was best to go inside our camp for the night. We never did find out anything. I've only been back to the camp once since then. Really freaked me out. I've lived in the Smokies most of my life. Anywhere I've lived in the Smokies, I've been completely surrounded by woods, naturally. One night at like 1 a.m. I was sitting on my porch drinking a beer. If you haven't lived out here, during the summertime, nature is loud. It isn't quiet. Cicadas humming, frogs belching, etc. It's like the ultimate white noise. While I was drinking my beer, I had noticed that everything in the woods had gone quiet. Which is pretty easy to notice when you live here because that doesn't happen. Suddenly, I heard the most terrifying noise I had ever heard about, I think maybe a good 30 or 40 meters away from me. It was a loud, shrieking, literally blood-curdling scream like shrill. It sounded non-human. It wasn't a mountain lion because I've heard them before, and they're rare in the area I lived. I stood up, audibly said nope, and walked the duck inside. That was the one and only time that ever happened. I still live in the same house, and still drink the same beer on the same porch. Backwoods hiking/camping trip up in Maine. Trail intersected overgrown logging road. Check topo map. Saw logging toad lead to isolated pond. Hike to pond. Found small clearing. Perfect spot to camp. Went to bed shortly after sunset, 8:30 p.m.-ish, woke up around 1:30 a.m. to distant but loud noises coming from all angles around us. Up the logging road both directions, across the pond and in the woods. Deep bass Y groans and hoots, occasionally hitting higher pitched noted. Been in the woods for most of my adult life. Have come in contact with just about all the larger mammals of the Northeast and have never heard those noises before. Haven't heard them again either. Will never forget that sound. I was driving from Tucson to Denver in the middle of the night. Got tired, was pulling off and crawl in a sleeping bag in the desert far away from the 2-lane blacktop I was on, Highway 666 BTW, it's since been renamed because everybody was stealing the signs. Anyway, pull off the road, onto a dirt road and then a little further. Kind of hid the truck behind some vegetation and tossed down a sleeping bar and pad in the middle of pitch black Huge Star, New Mexico night. No one around, no light, nothing at all. Visibility for miles. I'm completely fucking alone in pitch black nothing and getting wound down in my eyes are getting droopy. Then I hear it. It sounds goofy to say but it's the same Indian music you'd hear in old black and white westerns. Native music, voices, and a drum. I literally think I'm dreaming and when it starts I'm fucking petrified because that noise just appearing out of nothing simply put ice in my veins. Relax a little and unfreeze, and try to be logical about what I'm hearing, which has no physical manifestation of its origin, so thinking logically, now instead of pure panic. I could be on the reservation at this point. Perhaps it's coming from behind a previously unseen hill. I get up, look around. I don't see anything at all. It kind of comes and goes in volume. Doesn't seem to be coming from a direction. I have no clue. I looked for evidence and didn't find any. Crawled back in the bag because I'd been driving for hours, and they sang all night. Logic tells me it had to be a group of people I didn't see. But I looked, and there were no ancillary noises like talking or stopping or anything. Just that Indian drum. And the hi-ya hi-yat. What was originally terrifying became calming and I ended up sleeping fantastically. Later learned that was a terrible stretch of road for very bad things to happen. It sort of lived up to its 666 moniker for wrecks and bad shit occurring apparently. I love to share a story my uncle told. TLDR at the bottom. In 1992 he owned about 150 acres in a remote area of East Tennessee. On this land he had a large fishing pond and a stream running through it, and he used to leave lines out at night to pull in big catfish. This pond was accessible by 2 small game trails through thick patches of woods, and he would need to drive to the trail entrances from his house near the front of the property and walk about a half-mile in with his gear and nothing but a headlamp for light. This was something he did pretty often, and my uncle was a lover of the outdoors, so this was business as usual for him. Vietnam vet as well. Anyway, this particular night in July 1992, he went down to the pond at about 9:30 p.m. to check his lines. As he was doing so, he heard a loud splash and assumed it was a fish jumping. He carried on with what he was doing and then heard a low, guttural groan and what he described as monkeys flighting just on the other side of the pond. It was about 70 yards across. Multiple loud splashes occurred and he also heard a loud crash in the woods just yards away to his left. He talked about how he immediately felt a sense of panic and was attempting to get visuals using his headlamp, but whatever was producing these sounds was behind tree cover. He said that the woods then erupted in continued sounds of fighting monkeys, and he opted to drop his gear and run down the trail toward his truck. Apparently, even in his adrenaline-fueled state, he could hear footfall on his left as he was being hunted. He got to his truck and hauled ass out of there to the road and back to his home, which, mind you, sits on the property about 6 miles away. He went inside and locked every window and door, grabbed a gun, and stayed up and vigilant the entire night, but nothing more occurred. He called my dad the next day, who sort of just laughed it off. Well, for my uncle, whatever he experienced scared him so badly that he put his land up for sale and sold it a few months later. Until he died in 2017, he would maintain that he believes that he walked into a group of Sasquatch and they erupted in territorial displays to get him out of there. He never enjoyed the outdoors after that. This wasn't a man who I took for a liar. TLDR, my Vietnam vet/outdoorsman uncle claims he was chased out of the woods by a clan of Sasquatch and it scared him so badly he sold the property. We lived on the Hopi/Navajo reservation growing up. My mom and I were feeding the horses very early in the morning before I went to school. It was still almost completely dark out when we hear this low, dim humming noise. The horses start acting really nervous, ours included. Sweating, pacing, nostrils flared, eyes showing white, the works. We feed them and walk out from the barn/shack trying to figure out what's happened. We look up after scanning the horizon for anything, squinting as best as we could, and there is a black triangle-like thing hovering right over us. It was almost completely silent. It was perfectly over us so you couldn't see it unless you looked straight up, and it felt like it was so close I could touch it. It was pretty damn large too, like a long triangle. Smooth and black. Thinking back, it was actually quite impressive and beautiful. Mom grabbed me and ran back into the shed. This was before cell phones were really a thing, so she just clutched me and told me not to make a sound. We waited for what felt like ages but was probably only 2 to 3 more minutes. The horses weren't even eating, they just paced the shed inside back and forth. Finally the horses started settling down to eat and my mom went outside. It was gone. We felt like we had the flu the rest of the day and I stayed home. We never told my dad. I think it was some sort of military aircraft, since around the reservation there are quiet, secret military setups, but who knows. Well, thanks.